You to MC3 Germantown, our English service, and thankful that my mom is here this morning. So welcome, my mom. Yep. You can thank her for all that she put up with throughout my life, all that I put her through. So now you can see, I think that many of you have met my dad, who's half Chinese, so, you know, the Choi side. Now you see I look like my mom.
It's my turn to help out the
Proud,
kids.
I'm a mama's boy. So the boys were happy for Meemaw is what they call her. I couldn't argue, that's just what she told me. And I pushed on it for about 30 seconds, and I said, okay, you want him to call you Meemaw? But as we dig in this morning to Ephesians chapter 4, I want you to think about this, that the Christian faith is not primarily a belief. There are a lot of beliefs out there, right? There are a lot of things that people believe, and sometimes Christians are called what? Believers. I do not like that, and if you use that terminology, I would just encourage you not to say that, because everybody is a believer in something. And even many people who claim to be believers in Jesus are not Christians. They are not followers of Jesus. So I would encourage you, if this is your favorite word, that's okay. I mean, it's not wrong, okay? It's not wrong. But I do not like to be called, and I don't say that I'm a believer. I'm a follower of Jesus. But the Christian faith is primarily not a belief, it is a way of life. Everybody say, way of life.
Way of life.
That was good. All right, we're off to a good start. Christianity is primarily a way of life. It is a way of living that is different. It's about following the person of Jesus. Pretty simple. The Christian faith is about following the person of Jesus. Yes, we follow His teachings, right? We love His teachings. But more importantly, we follow Him. We follow Him. Ephesians, the book that we've been going through, is basically the how-to manual for following Jesus. How to live out the Christian, quote-unquote, way of life. What is the Christian way of life? What does somebody who is following Jesus look like? It's what Ephesians is all about. Chapter 4 gets really practical. I love it. It's one of my favorite chapters, books of the whole Bible. Now, most people who are far from God really do not have a problem with Jesus, unless they are in certain belief systems, right? There are certain belief systems that would be antagonistic to Jesus. But even think about Muslims, right? There's a lot of antagonistic feelings between Muslims and Christians, but they don't have a problem with Jesus, do they? I've talked to many Muslims, and they believe that Jesus was what? A prophet. They don't have a problem with Jesus. I've talked to many Hindu people, right? Hindus don't have a problem with Jesus. Jesus is just another what? He's another God. Yeah, He's a God. Jesus is God, along with my other mantle filled with gods. So they don't even have a problem primarily with Jesus being a God, lowercase g, right? So that is like almost the majority of the world, right? If you take Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, that's more than the majority of the world that really don't have a problem with Jesus. And then you talk to, people who claim to be agnostic or even atheists, they may or may not really have a problem with Jesus. What do they have a problem with? I heard a couple different things. What's that, Mom? Maybe. What did you say? The one way? Okay, maybe. I find that what people who have a hard time with, who are far from God, they have a people who claim to be Christians. Most people that I meet that have a problem with Christianity, what their problem is with the organized religion of Christianity. And what they mean is what? The people. That's what they mean. They don't know the teachings, it's not that they have a problem with the teaching. It's the people. Even if it's the teaching, they may be misinterpreted. In other words, sometimes, a lot of times, people think that what we want in the church is their money. Right? Well, that's a problem with the way people are the way certain leaders and certain teachers and certain pastors are portraying what they think the way of Christianity is. And that's wrong. It's not that they have a problem with Jesus. It's the way people are interpreting this way of life, or the way that people live one way and they talk about a different thing, this hypocritical kind of thing, right? It's the church folk. And there was the same thing in Jesus' day, right? Jesus didn't have a problem with strugglers and sinners, did he? What does the Bible say that Jesus did? I mean, he hung out with them. He spent time with them. He sought them. He healed them. He touched them. He partied with them. Lots of examples of that. Jesus didn't have a problem with strugglers and sinners. It was the religious leaders that Jesus had a problem with. Some of the harshest judgment in the Bible is found in Matthew 23, Woe to you, religious dudes, who think that blah, 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 everything that they're doing, this outward show, but their heart was far from God. So with that in mind, let's dive into God's Word in Ephesians chapter 4. And if you will listen to what God wants to say to you through His Word, you will get a clear direction. You will have a clear direction for this way of life, this Christian way of life. And then next week, as we come back to the end of chapter 4, there's going to be 5 very specific applications of this. But let's dig in here. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 to 19. Ephesians 4, 17 to 19. So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, right? The way of life, that your way of life should no longer be as the Gentiles. He's not talking about something that you believe. He's talking about how you live your life. You must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. So there's really 2 points here in how this Christian way of life is to be lived. Number 1, how not to live. That's what Paul just told us. How not to live like you used to. Don't live like you used to before you knew Jesus, as opposed to living in ignorance and darkness. So really, this is some additional instruction from verse 1, right? In verse 1, he says, as a prisoner of the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have lived. Did you catch that? Live your life. It's a way of life. The Christian faith is a way of living. And he says, based on chapters 1 to 3, all these blessings, right? Blessed be the God, Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in spiritual places with every spiritual blessing. And he goes on and on and on, right? Remember that? Chapter 1, all these things. Chapter 2, talking about the wall of separation between Jew and Gentile, and therefore between all peoples been broken down. Chapter 3, the mystery of Jesus, the prayer for power. He talked about humility, gentleness, and patience. And now he's saying, walk, therefore, in light of all of this, in light of this calling that God has really for all people, live your life worthy. It's a different way of living. So now he starts to give some additional things. He says, no longer as the Gentiles do. Well, who are the Gentiles? I mean, that was a way of saying, at that point, we don't really say it like that anymore, but people who are far from God, right? The people of God were the people who had the covenants and the promise and the law and the prophets. Those were the Jews. So Jews were the people of God. Gentiles, non-Jews, were not people of God, although there are examples in the Old Testament and then in the book of Acts where there were God-fearing Gentiles. And Gentiles could come to the temple, and there was a court called the Gentile court. They couldn't go into where the Jews were allowed to go closer. But there was a court where God-fearing Gentiles that believed in God. But the word Gentile, the way Paul's using it here, simply means people far from God. What did they live like? Well, it's their aim or their goal in life is not worthy. So he's contrasting, you live your life, make your way of life worthy, as opposed to people who don't know God, who are not living for worthy purposes. Do you know some people like that? Some people that are living for some reason that might be good, or it may not be good, but it's just not a worthy cause. People that don't align their lives around things that matter. And he's going to be real specific about what are those things that matter. Helping people matters to a degree, but that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things if we're missing some other things, right? Just feeding people who are poor is really, really good. Making the world a better place is really a good thing, right? But it's not good enough. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of eternity. It can completely miss the purpose of life, although it can be very good, right? This is the idea when Paul says the futility of their thinking. He's talking about all people who are not Christians. So, he's not talking about any particular field, any particular practice, any particular habit, any particular career. He's saying every person who's not a Christian, the purpose of their life is not worthy. And then he's going to talk about, well, what does that mean? It means that they have futile thinking. So there are some very smart, intelligent people doing amazing things, aren't there? Think of some examples, right? I was thinking through this past week. I was thinking about tech companies. I was thinking about the company that Shaolin and Shimon work for. And some of you may not know a lot more about this than I do, but Laura's mom has diabetes, right? So she has to prick her arm, and she's got to constantly test herself, and it's a challenge, right? How many of you have somebody in your family that's true of them too, right? Have that kind of diabetes, right? Okay, so several of you, right? So, it's like every day, like many times throughout the day, and they have to test it, they have to eat the right things. If they don't eat the right things, blood sugar goes up and down, right? Well, the company that Shaolin and Shimon are working for, they're making this thing that is overly simplification. Basically, they're creating a watch, and then that watch is linked to a chip, and the chip goes in your skin. So they have a constant monitor of their blood sugar, and they never have to prick themselves to test their blood. Isn't that cool? Like, that's awesome, For somebody who's in the home, whenever I go to visit Laura's mom, when I go into her home and I see that, it always kind of stirs up in me something like, it's kind of like uncomfortable. This technology could change every person. This is a huge issue, right, in America right now. Huge. I don't remember what the percentages are, but a huge percentage of you, if you follow the trends of American dieting, which many of you won't, but some of you will. That's pretty awesome, right? That's an awesome company. They're doing an awesome thing. That changes people's lives. What about new cars? Last week on 60 Minutes, anybody see 60 Minutes last week? I can't remember the name of the car, but this dude has built two amazing companies. One company is a company that NASA has contracted for their rockets. Imagine that being your company, NASA, right? So he has sent, I think, 4 rockets now up to the space station. He made this company himself, Silicon Valley. And then his other company is these electric cars that are like supercars. Yeah, the Tesla. They're amazing, right? So the Tesla is amazing. This guy, one guy created this company. You may have heard PayPal. He's the guy who created PayPal and sold it for like $1 billion. Huh? Oh, his name. Yeah, something like that. So he created PayPal, sold it for like $1 billion, and then he had all this money. So what do? He create a company that builds rockets. That was always kind of a goal of his when he was a kid. And then create a supercar company. That's awesome! Like, what he wants to do is build these charging stations all over the U.S. because they only have like a 250-mile radius or driving capacity. He wants to put free charging stations all over the country. And the big challenge right now is how does he take the price from $100,000 to $35,000? That's what he's working on. That could change the world, right? Like that, this one guy, one company can change the world when it comes to transportation. Pretty cool, I think. Maybe you don't think so. How about buildings? Like, buildings are amazing. New technological advances. Buildings are getting higher and more modern and cool stuff. High-speed trains fascinate me. And just think about the world of entertainment and the things that people give their time and their money and they sacrifice for in the world of entertainment and how significant that is in your life today, right? Those are pretty cool things. You know, people who aren't Christians and people who are Christians who give their lives to those kinds of things. They're not bad things, but as an end, they are futile. If you give your life to those things as an end, it's futile. Talked about this last week, right? You sacrifice yourself as a teenager to study real hard, to get into that school so that you can get that good job somewhere in there, find a woman or a man that will say yes to marry you. You have some kids or not, and you have this good life, and then you finally get a little more finances, you get up on your feet, you buy a house, and then if you're blessed to have kids, then maybe those kids go off to college, right? And the whole cycle goes all over again, and then finally you're a grandma, you know, my mom's me mom. You know, finally you're a grandma, and then what? If you're not living for a purpose that is higher, Paul says, I'm not making it up, Paul says it's futile. He says they're darkened in their understanding. They lack living a worthy purpose. And when you lack living a worthy purpose, it rests on a darkened or unclear understanding. An understanding of what? Life. The meaning of life. The purpose of life. Do you see people all around you? They just lack purpose. They're living for something. When I was a teenager, most of my teenage years, and then after high school, I was living for the next fill in the blank. I mean, it was just the next party, the next show, the next gathering, the next get-together, the next fun thing, the next girlfriend. Whatever, right? That's the way so many people live. And you can fill in the blank with good things. Okay, so it was parties and girls with that. Fill in the next thing, right? Just fill in the blank. The next promotion, the next season of life, the next positive thing, the next achievement, the next medallion, the next reward, the next, amount of money, the next investment, or whatever. Those who live with unclear understanding, Paul says, they're separated from the life of God. Somebody only lives like that when they are, catch it, separated from the life of God. That's how I was. I was living my life chasing these next things, chasing significance. Why? Ultimately, I didn't understand it then, but now I can look back and easily see, it's because I was separated from the life of God. I didn't have that life that gave me that purpose. There were some good things mixed in there, Separation ultimately comes from having a natural ignorance of God and His ways. I'm not making this up. I mean, this is just what Paul says. People live in that state because, notice he says, the hardening, verse 18, the hardening of their hearts. Now, catch this. Jesus said to His disciples, your hearts are hard. We see, back in the Old Testament, we see Pharaoh's heart was both hard and God hardened his heart. So the hardness of heart is this. This is a tweetable statement here. People living as God rather than surrendering their lives to God. A hard heart, this could be a Christian, right? You felt this way sometime today, probably, right? You felt at some point you made some decision as if you were God, and so did I. So having a hard heart is living as if you are God rather than surrendering your life to God. So characteristically, that is all people who are far from God, right? Because they're not surrendering their life to God. But that could also be Christians. And he's saying, you Christians put off this kind of life. You Christians put off this way of living. And hold that thought. We'll clarify that here in a minute, right? Okay. So the hardening of their hearts People who are far from God, their hearts are hard, and they can't do anything but live as if they are God. That's pretty harsh. I mean, you know some good people probably, like I do. And you wouldn't think, well, they don't think that they're God, but they're making decisions as if they are. Lowercase g, right? Now, I'm not saying they think they're a divinity here. They're Nebuchadnezzar. Not putting up a statue like Nebi, or anything like that, but in their heart, there's a lowercase g that says, I'm in control. As opposed to saying, God, you are in control. Verse 19, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity. So as a result of all this, what he says in verse 17 and 18, those that are far from God typically give themselves over to lives of sensual self-indulgence. I want to read to you some verses from Romans chapter 1. I believe, this is it's not just my own opinion like I made it up, but I believe that the Darwinian theory of evolution came about because of this. Listen as I read. Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 21. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him, but their thinking became futile. Sounds familiar? And their foolish hearts were darkened. A fool is someone who makes themselves a little g God. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Verse 24, therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshiped the created things rather than the Creator, who is praised forever. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with one another and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Verse 28, furthermore, they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. So He gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. That's a long passage. I mean, there's a lot of things in there. But I think that the genesis of the whole idea of evolution comes from this desire that people have to reject the revelation that God's given them so that they can be their own God. Not divinity. I'm not saying like Darwin was trying to be his own God or anything like that. But I've read enough, and if you dig into, especially a guy named Michael Behe, B-E-H-E, very difficult reading. If you're a scientist, you'll enjoy it. I'm not, so I struggled through some of that. Read something like Darwin's Black Box. The theory has been completely disproven by non-Christian PhD scientists. And I think that what was going on is exactly what Paul's describing here in Ephesians 4, and he talked about in Romans chapter 1. They just wanted to do what they wanted to do. And what happens when somebody starts going down that road, how does God respond to that? Go ahead. Because what's God doing? He's just knocking. He's just knocking. He's knocking, and instead of, opening the door and saying, God, come in every room. I want you to come in every room of my life. We got the chain on the door. So we open to the chain. Okay, God, how do I really know it's you? Prove that it's you. I sent my son. No, I got that, but I don't. Look at all the evil that's going on in the world. How could all of this be happening if you're really the real God? No, God, I'll keep the door open like this, but you got to prove yourself. And then it's like, okay, all right. So finally, we don't want to go to hell, right? Who wants to go to hell? So we open the door and we say, okay, God, okay, come on in and take your shoes off. And you can hang out in my living room right over here. But you got like the police tape up for the rest of the house. And you got like the basement door like shackled, with iron bars. And no way God's getting into that. And the attic, there's like a, 40-foot ladder that's, sucked all the way up to the top. and you didn't give him the password, so God's welcome in your living room, but that's it. He wants to be in your whole house. Notice the end of Paul's description of the old person. And they are full of what? Check it out. They indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of. They are full of. We don't like to say that, right? Even to say greed. Well, I wonder what that is. Maybe because we relate to with what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, you Christians in the church, put off this old way of life and evaluate yourself. Where's there greed in your life? And it's not too hard for me to say, man, I got to really evaluate this. So when some of you even see that, you don't even want to say that word because you know that there's some pieces of it that are lingering in your life. That's why Paul wrote this. What does that mean? It's an increasing desire for more and more. I don't need to tell you what greed means. We all understand it. We all live it and experience it. Sinful passions and desires that are never satisfied. We can all relate to this. We can all relate to this, I'm sure. Many of us have come from that kind of lifestyle. That was my kind of lifestyle, right? And some of you are still in this kind of lifestyle where you're seeking more and more. You have these desires and they're not satisfied, so you're seeking for more. And I know that there's a lot of people in church. This is their life. This is the way their life is described. I talked to you last week about how I ran into Officer Wojin in Panera Bread, and he was telling me about all these text messages that he sees from kids. Not text messages, tweets of kids that when they get out of church, they're posting all the kind of things that they're doing. And his wife is a high school teacher, so they understand the culture. Many of us, adults in the church, were blind to what's really going on. But I remember Laura and I worked at a youth camp. That's kind of where we met. We actually got engaged at a place called Word of Life Island. Woo! And yeah, thank you. And so for 9 weeks, teenagers would come up, the part of the camp that we worked at, the teenagers would come up, and I had a staff of 150. So there were 100 teenagers and 50 college students that basically ran the operations of the camp. The kitchen, the lifeguarding, and all that kind of stuff, right? And so we would live, the first 2 years, I was like a supervisor, and then I was a unit leader, and then for 2 years I directed that part of the camp. So it just blew me away. I was so convinced at the end of the summer, when I would see parents, I'd say, we know your kids better than you do. You do not know your kids. I'm certain that you don't know your kids as good as we know your kids. Because we lived with them. We lived with them, we worked with them, and we played with them. 24 hours a day. And you can't hide stuff for 9 weeks. Stuff comes out. It was wonderful. I mean, it was awesome. Lots of transformation going on. It was awesome. So, we believe in this funnel of responsibility. As kids get older, they need more and more responsibility, but that doesn't mean they need mom and dad to be less and less and less involved. So for the parents that are in the room, your kids that are teenagers, I hope you have an increasing, growing relationship with your teen. Not the helicopter mom. What are you doing? Where are you going? Where are you doing? Where are you going? Who are you going to be with? What are you going to be? I'm not talking about that. Because as much as the young person needs a growing level of responsibility, mom and dad also need a growing, a changing type of relationship. So, I command Emmett, he's 5. I tell him what to do. To a lesser degree, Elijah. I still do. I'm still in command of Elijah. But as he gets older, he has more and more responsibility. And my relationship with him now, even though he's only 10, but it's starting to change a little bit. And as he gets toward, high school and then to college, I become more of a coach. And then I just become more of a, hopefully after college, more of a friend and a source of wisdom that he can come to. But you have to build into that, right? I have no idea where that came from. That was not in the notes. I'm sure it has nothing to do with greed. But now the Bible is clear, right? Paul's saying, put off the old. And he's described at length the old. That's what we just talked about. Now listen to the description the Apostle Paul gives of the new. So it's off with the old. Y'all excited about that? We're going to put off the old, and now he's going to teach us how do we put on the new. And so let's